Welcome to WizeUp. I'm Paul Arthur. Abortion, pro-life. Can I say those words without getting a lot of people upset? Yeah, probably not so much. It always becomes an issue, certainly around election time, that's for sure. And I think often it becomes a wedge issue, right? But I wonder, how informed are we as Canadians on pro-life issues? Well, we're going to chat about that and more today. We're joined by Susan Penner. She is the Executive Director of Life Culture. That's a pro-life organization in Steinbach, Manitoba. Their website, lifeculture.ca. Good to have you with us, Susan.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so pleased to be here.
Yeah, so much to talk about. I mean, why don't we just jump into the deep end here? So recently, the Prime Minister, Trudeau, has been getting some headlines, a little bit controversial here, by announcing legislation changes to the Income Tax Act, which would remove charitable tax status from pro-life pregnancy crisis centers that provide, quote, dishonest counseling to women about their pregnancy options. So basically, as I understand it, the groups would need to publicly disclose that they don't provide abortions or birth control, nor make referrals. So your thoughts on that one there, Susan?
Well, this is very interesting because Canada has never had more access to abortion than it does now. So first of all, that's interesting because this isn't really an issue if it comes to a woman who wants to access abortion. Second of all, I would say this is a huge double standard as organizations that promote abortion or offer it are not required to give options for life. So
Oh,
it's
isn't that
interesting.
interesting? So
Yeah,
there's no requirement? Okay.
yeah. So it's a really one-sided announcement, I would say. This government doesn't seem to comprehend that there's actually women who would like to keep their babies and would like options to.
Like that ever happens, does it?
Right,
Of
right,
course it does.
exactly. So the other thing I would say is all roads really lead back to a woman's doctor. So even to insinuate that we would offer medical advice doesn't make sense. We
Hmm.
pregnancy resource centers offer support,
Right.
information for women. And the other part to remember is women are choosing to visit these centers. Nobody's forcing them to go. They're actively looking for information on what their options are. So I think this is another one of those things where our government, the Liberal government's in trouble at the polls. Um, there's an election coming up in 2025, so they tend to use this issue, as you mentioned, to drive a wedge in Canadians and create this culture of fear, which I would say is a good motivator, but it's not good leadership.
Hmm. Yeah, it becomes a wedge issue, right?
Mhm.
I mean, well, I guess we'd have to ask the question too. What is dishonest information? Who determines that? Like, how do you define that, and who actually defines it?
Well, I would think in to this government, anything that doesn't support or promote abortion is
Hmm.
considered disinformation. Um, it's really what it gets down to because what I am seeing is that there isn't objective and neutral decision on this topic. People aren't hearing about it in schools, in the media, in the medical system, nowhere. So I would say there's a lot of bias, but it is towards being pro abortion.
Hmm. Again, becomes a wedge issue around election time,
Hmm.
and I think can I say that most pro-choice folks actually do mean well. And I maybe have some viewers mad at me for saying that, but I think they actually do. I think they're just not very well informed, well educated on, what actually happens in an abortion, the different stages of development, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of misinformation out there. Your thoughts?
Oh, I think that's a hugely important point. I've been doing this work for around 4 years now in a formal capacity. And by far, the vast majority of people are reasonable, want to talk
Hmm.
about it, would actually support some limits. Um, so I don't think we should frame it as people who support abortion as being, um, people who support the death of babies. That's not what it is at all. I think there's a small percentage of activists, and I'd probably put our government in that category, who are
Hmm.
constantly bringing this up, constantly trying to use it to create fear in people. Again, I think the number one thing I would say I notice is people just really don't know a lot about it because they are
Hmm.
never educated and informed on it. So as you inform people and share information and educate them, you're much more likely to persuade them to get more on the side of life. Whether they become 100% pro-life or not, that's up in the air. But for sure, people tend to want to, um, support women who actually do choose life as well. The average person realizes should be an objective choice and not just automatically go to an abortion.
Yeah, there's some research to be done here, I think, for
Hmm.
the average Canadian. Hopefully, they do ask some questions and hopefully they get some
Right.
informed answers.
Mhm.
I mean, how would you respond to somebody who would say, well, Susan, you're anti choice? Okay, we hear that all the time. I think the assumption is that you're against a woman's, right to make a choice about her body as it relates to reproductive rights and so forth, having children or not. How would you respond to being called anti-choice?
Well, this is interesting. There was a study done by the American Journal of Physicians and Surgeons. I believe it was maybe around 2017. And that study showed that 74% of women who'd had an abortion faced external pressure to do so. So we are under this impression in our culture that women are just making the decision to abort like on their own with no outside influence. We hear the my body, my choice constantly, but that's not actually what's happening. What's happening is women face tremendous external pressure, whether it's from the father of the baby, their family, their friends, whoever it may be. Um, so I think the real question is, how do we get women to be able to make an objective decision free from that pressure? Because from my experience, at least in our office, the vast majority of women want to keep their babies. If
Isn't
they're
that
choosing abortion,
interesting?
yeah, it is often because
Wow.
the people who should be their support system are not, are choosing
So,
not
so
to.
this again. You mentioned this. I mean, I understand there's pressure probably from boyfriends,
Hmm.
or from parents even, or
Yeah,
grandparents.
absolutely.
Wow.
As
Maybe
hard
it's a
as that
shame.
is
Maybe
to
it's a
believe.
shame to the family. I mean, I've heard of
Hmm.
this happening in church settings as well, where there's just so
Absolutely.
much shame there. They'd actually rather go through the abortion. Seems crazy, but that
Mhm.
happens, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, I mean, I don't mind if people call me labels, but again, I'm very mindful of the fact that most people are operating from a position where they don't actually have information or facts on this. So
Hmm.
I use those opportunities to say, hey, well, did you actually know that 74% of women have faced face external pressure when they choose their abortion? So that education piece is super important. So when you come up against these things, you don't need to be defensive. You don't need to be angry or get worked up.
Hmm.
Actually, this is what I know about that. And it often leads to a good conversation.
That's what we need is more
Mhm.
meaningful
Yeah.
conversations. We need to wise up, right? Okay, and get into something that actually makes a difference rather than
Mhm.
just name calling and getting mad at each other. I think there's often concern from pro-choice folks as well when it comes to there's concern for the woman who's now pregnant and it was unexpected. Lots of pressure on this young woman. What's she going to go through as a single mother, and will she be able to, continue. Maybe she was going to university, continue education, or whatever it is. Am I equipped to raise a child on my own? Financial pressure. Can we find some common ground here? Is abortion necessarily the only or the best option?
Well, I think this touches on an important point that we don't necessarily see when we talk about abortion, or even when it comes to medical assistance in dying, is when you frame suffering as a choice. So, for example, if a
Okay.
single girl is pregnant, or if a woman receives a diagnosis that her baby, or her baby receives a diagnosis in utero, that if you choose to have that baby, hey, it was your choice. Now you can deal with it. If it's hard for you, you had a way out.
Right.
So I think that's very concerning because in life there's suffering, there's hardship. We know that that is a part of it, but those are also the things that tend to um, bring the greatest joy and meaning at the end of
Hmm.
it.
Hmm.
So I'm really concerned about when we talk about abortion and MAID in terms of, well, it was your choice and now you're on your own. Again, it's those support systems tend not to step up the way they should because there was a way out if you had wanted it. And I would say, a couple of years ago, a woman came into our office and she said she'd had her son when she was 15 years old. And she came in and she said, there are worse things than an unexpected pregnancy. She said it was hard at the time, but now her son is this wonderful adult. He has a child now, and
Oh,
we're really
wow.
hijacking our whole system of life, our whole families, when we're ending the lives of the very ones who are supposed to bring us meaning. And in this culture that
Hmm.
is struggling with loneliness and isolation, I often think back to, wow, we're missing like 5 million people that should be in
Huh.
Canada since abortion was legalized in
Yeah,
1969.
I don't know if people ponder that very
Yeah,
often,
no,
and
there's
and
like,
and we should.
yeah, brothers, sisters, you know, eh, all these things I hear regularly from women who come to me and say, my mom just told me she had aborted my sibling. And the
Hmm.
siblings grieve because they're
Wow.
missing a sibling. So I think we're really short-sighted on abortion because like one of the things I would say is if you're in a situation where a woman doesn't know what to do right now, it seems really big and really huge. It's a huge situation. But what's it going to look like in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years? And it was interesting. Angus Reid did a survey. I think it was last year. I read it I think it was in the National Post. And it said that women, 59% of women, I believe it was, wish they'd had more children.
Oh, wow.
But it's not politically correct to say that, right? So
Right.
what we're finding is when people get to my age, like in your 40s and 50s, women are wishing they'd had more children,
Hmm.
not less. So our whole perspective on motherhood and having families needs to change. It needs to be more holistic. It's not just
Okay.
about your 20s. It's also about what happens later in life. And we're actually
Hmm.
hijacking that system, and we can see the negative outcomes of that now.
I think we need to share some more stories like that, where, you know what, there's been, yes, a difficult road,
Mm-hmm.
but big picture, wow, this had really good outcomes down
Yeah.
the road and even through the generations,
Mm-hmm.
having a son, and that son having children, etc. That's a good, actually, I just saw, it was a pro-life website somewhere. I can't remember exactly which one. And they said, hey, check this out. I believe it was Volvo, just put together, it was a kind of a lengthy, ad, but it
Yeah.
was about an unexpected,
Mm-hmm.
pregnancy. And
Yeah.
of course, it's advertising, the world's safest car, whatever. And that's great. Want to
Mm-hmm.
keep the kids safe. I get it. But it was just really well done
That's a
when,
very powerful commercial. My husband
yeah.
he was like, Susan, you have to see this ad.
Hmm.
It was really powerful.
So hats off to Volvo. I'm sure I'm kind of doubt that they actually had a pro-life message in mind. That wasn't the primary concern. But
Right.
to frame, family, children in a
Mm-hmm.
positive light like that,
Yeah.
and, unexpected situations, you know what?
Mm-hmm.
Hey, there's struggle with it, but, really good outcome. The sanctity of life was honored there. And I'm saying, you know what? God bless them. We need more of that sort of thing. I think that can, how do you change minds? How do you win the battle? Maybe that's part of it right there. We can pick up
Mm-hmm.
something from this Volvo commercial.
Yeah.
Now, let me ask you this. Do most Canadians know, I guess, what a fetus is? I mean, of course they do in one sense, and yet in another sense they don't, because we always hear it's a blob of tissue, etc., right? And I don't think they, I mean, maybe, well, correct me, maybe they do, but, the level of development at the various stages, do we know when those little fingers, are formed, when the heart starts beating, when they can feel pain, these kinds of things, where are Canadians at?
Oh, I'd say we're very uneducated on that. And that's
Okay.
intentional, right? Like so many things are intentional
Hmm.
to not give life value. I would say our government in particular does not really uh, value life.
Hmm.
What's important to understand is scientifically, we know that life begins at conception. 96% of scientists agree. So
Hmm.
that's not
That's
a
a pretty high number.
yeah, it's a non-issue that a human life has begun.
Okay.
Uh, and now, so initially, when the pro-life movement started, let's say in the mid 50s, 60s, 70s, that time. It's hard to believe because of where we are now, but in terms
Hmm.
of technology, when it comes to ultrasounds, MRIs, that technology wasn't readily available. So people kind of were making up these arbitrary points of
Right.
when life has value or
Yeah.
doesn't. But you know, we've made such advancements in medical science that we know life begins at conception, that it's a baby. So in order to respond to that, this theory called personhood theory was developed. Um, and the point of that is, yeah, a life may be human by virtue of us, there's our species, but it is not a person until it reaches a certain level of development. Okay, so
Hmm.
trying to minimize that as human life. Now, the question is, at what point does it become a person with value and rights? And really, that's totally arbitrary. So it's like, okay, 12 weeks. Oh, no, maybe it's 20 weeks, or maybe it's when it's born. Canadian law would say that we're a person after we're actually born, not
Yeah. So that 6 inches down the birth canal separates
yeah,
human from non-human.
correct.
And I mean, again, I mean, I
Well, and
think
they
the
wouldn't
the
say
average.
human from non-human, person from non-person.
Well, okay, but whatever terms you want to use there, I think
Yeah.
the same. I mean, to me, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm thinking the vast majority of pro-choice people as well would go, "That's absurd."
Oh, absolutely. But the thing is, it has to be all or nothing. Otherwise, it's arbitrary. Who gets to decide at
Yeah.
what point? So when you support abortion on demand at any stage, anything goes. And
Yeah.
if you look at it even now, when we're looking at medical assistance in dying, well, whose life has value and who doesn't? What if a person
Hmm.
has intellectual disabilities, or what if a person is aging and is further stages of dementia? Is their personhood now doesn't exist anymore because
Right.
their level of cognition is at some arbitrary level or not at that level? It really complicates things. It's such a much better perspective to have this culture of life where life has value. Think of how that would
Hmm.
simplify things. You know what? Life has value. And a point I want to make, though, is when you support life, it doesn't mean you necessarily support disproportionate medical intervention. Science has gone so far that sometimes we extend life beyond
Hmm.
where it
Right.
should be extended, or
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
keep it alive more
Yeah.
than we should. But that is very choosing to end a life is very different than a life passing naturally.
Hmm. Hmm.
So we would advocate that we naturally pass away, um, and
Yeah,
that.
yeah, exactly. So, yeah, I mean, that makes sense what you're saying there.
Mhm.
I think, though, it's very interesting that a number of disability groups in Canada, and I don't think they're all, Christian disability groups, but they're very concerned that currently we're seeing people with disabilities who are vulnerable. They don't have enough money. There's not enough supports out there to meet their individual, needs because of their disabilities. So they're feeling trapped. They can't afford to pay the rent. Some of them are homeless, etc. So they're turning to MAID. They're seeing that as the I don't know if the only, but the best option at this point. And it's really interesting. You listen to some of the secular talk shows, people are calling in and saying, yeah, it doesn't seem right to me. That needs to change.
Yeah, MAID is totally out of control in Canada. The legislation needs to be pulled back. Absolutely. When there was committee
Yeah.
hearings, so MAID was legalized in 2016, and then the legislation was for you should be have a terminal diagnosis, be within a couple of weeks of death, that type of thing. In 2021, they changed the legislation and expanded it. When the committee hearings were happening, discussing whether MAID should be expanded or not, dozens and dozens and dozens of disability groups went to Parliament Hill, presented that MAID should not be expanded to allow people with disabilities, and the government just ignored that, implemented it anyways. So if you don't mind, I want to share a quick story.
Sure.
I got an email from a woman. This is probably about 2 years ago, and the email said, like, I'm done. I'm at my rope's end, or
Hmm.
end of my rope. I'm being paneled for MAID. I got back to her and asked her what was going on. She's a 38-year-old woman. She is legally blind. She was living in downtown Winnipeg, did not feel safe there.
Hmm.
She was really isolated and lonely coming out of COVID. And I just said to her, Okay, so what would it take to, get you to change your mind? What she really wanted was to move to a safer
Hmm.
neighborhood where she could access public transit, a grocery store. Our organization gave her $1,000 to help with the move. That's all she needed. She
Wow.
moved. I get emails from her almost monthly thanking me for saving her life. All we did
Wow.
was give $1,000, but she's in a much better place. She's advocating now for people with
That's a
disabilities.
good investment.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really doesn't take a lot. It takes some caring and concern by the rest of us, obviously. Um, but it's really outrageous. Our
Hmm.
government talks about diversity, equity, and inclusion,
Yeah, yeah.
DEI ad nauseum. Yet, as soon as a baby in the womb is diagnosed with a disability, or somebody with a disability, um, you know, is overwhelmed and decides to go the maid path, they're okay with it. Like, it's just this gross
Yeah.
hypocrisy and inconsistency. On the one hand,
Wow.
we value DEI. On the other hand, actually, they're better off dead. So it's
Let's
really,
invest in people even when
yeah,
they're in their latter years. They
absolutely.
have value even,
Hmm.
if they have disabilities or if they're late in life. Let's
Hmm.
provide palliative care. That can knit families together as
Yeah,
well. And in some cases, I know there's extremes where the family doesn't hang around
yeah.
the parents anymore, the
Hmm.
grandparents. And again, well, it's a whole other program, but that's where I think the followers of Christ need to step in and say, I'll be that. I'll be that person.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
We had a volunteer who worked at a hospice for a few years, and she
Hmm.
just said that end of lifetime is so profoundly beautiful and meaningful for families. They come together, they reconcile. And she said,
Yeah.
like, May just hijacks these
Oh
opportunities
man.
that families have. We lose, so we frame it as that other person relieve their suffering, relieve
Hmm.
those things, but families lose. And it also prevents governments from investing in things like better pain care, better medical care, because it's the easy way out.
Yeah, it seems like the easy way out, but again,
Yeah.
big picture, it's not a good investment
Hmm.
doing that, I think.
Hmm.
Let me ask you about, I guess, when you look at the whole globe, Canada, is kind of on the extreme end when it comes to abortion.
Hmm.
Compared to other wealthy nations. Most of them have some sort of limitations on abortion. Some of them are like maybe 12 weeks, some are maybe higher, 20, 22 weeks, and so forth. European countries, like Germany, Sweden, etc., the UK. He, is that something we need to aim for? I mean, realistically, it doesn't look like anything's going to change on abortion in Canada anytime soon. But we're working toward that, right? So we need to change hearts and minds. It's not going to be politicians who have the answer. I think it needs to come from the bottom up, from the grassroots up. People's hearts and minds need to be changed. So how do we go about doing that? Maybe that's where we need to aim for, is putting some limitations on abortion in Canada. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't see any political will to
Hmm.
touch the abortion issue or change anything when it comes to abortion. I think one thing I would say when it comes to pro life, what we need to think about when it comes to abortion is why do women value abortion so much?
Hmm.
Why has it
Hmm.
become the symbol of empowerment? And that's something I think about quite often. And if you don't mind, I just want to read a few Stats.
Sure.
According to the Social Sciences and Research Council, 20 to 25% of Canadian girls are sexually abused before the age of 18. 30% of Canadian women have reported being sexually assaulted at least once since the age of 15. That's from StatsCan. 1 in 17 women will be raped, and these numbers are grossly underreported. 94% of police reported human trafficking victims were women and girls. 44% of women have experienced intimate partner violence in their life. So I think one of the things we need to do is have a bit of a deeper understanding and broader
Right.
perspective of why people are so passionate about abortion. So when you hear stats like that, there's a lot of bad things that have been done and are being done to women, statistically speaking.
Hmm. Hmm.
And we need to care about those things too. When you hear stats like that, you understand why women want empowerment and they need this symbol of empowerment. Unfortunately, abortion has become that, but abortion is actually a symptom. of these things. It shouldn't be considered a symbol, it's a symptom of these things. So I think if we want to reach our culture, those of us who speak for life need to try and take a bit of a broader perspective. So our organization, we can't be all things to everybody. We focus specifically on like pro-life, abortion, MAID, those things. I'm not saying we can touch all these issues, but I at least need to have an awareness and understand where this is coming from. It's not because people want to kill their
Yeah.
babies.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, I really think you're onto something here, and we need to pay attention to what you're saying. We talked about having meaningful conversations with
yeah.
people. Generally speaking, from my experience, meaningful conversations don't start, on this particular topic when you're wearing a T-shirt that says abortion is murder. Now, it may be factually true in one sense, but, if you want walls to come down and start to relate to these people and love them and have some understanding,
Yeah,
to me, that's just not where to start.
absolutely. I agree.
Okay. Man. How do we wrap this up, I guess? Any thoughts on, where we go from here? How do we get involved? I mean, a lot of churches are very hesitant to get involved as well, but I think this has got to be one of the most important issues to Jesus. Correct me if you think I'm wrong, folks, but I'm pretty sure he loves everybody. And he wants these little guys to, to live out their destiny. Any quick thoughts on that?
I would say the number one word I would use to describe this whole thing is fear. So people are scared to talk
Yeah.
about it. And also
Yeah.
there's a lack of education.
I think fear is a huge thing. We've got to overcome that and just jump in and be kind and gracious and truthful and share the education, the information we have with others. Susan Pinner, Executive Director, Life Culture, lifeculture.ca. Check it out. Good organization, I think. Thanks for watching. Really appreciate it. You can see the whole podcast at WizeUp.ca. Tell your friends or at app.corcoplus.com. Email us any questions or suggestions you might have. Paul at WizeUp.ca. God bless.